Oh.
And I invite you, Claude, the MSc Justice Coordinator, to lead us in an acknowledgement of country.
Thank you. Thank you very much. And thank you, everyone, for joining us today. I just want to say that this document that we are in some way commemorating 60 years of comes from the pastoral heart of a man who was reaching out to a world that was burgeoning in violence after the Second World War. It was the Cold War, the Berlin Wall, the Cuban Missile Crisis, and so on. And he was trying to prescribe a way forward for an anxious humanity that was preoccupied with geopolitical conflict and social divisiveness. Pacem in Terris, this document that's for the focus tonight, argues and continues to argue that a recognition and respect and safeguard and promotion of human rights of all are essential for authentic peace and justice. And our esteemed speakers today will, in diverse ways, address some of those issues today. I'd like to begin now by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the land on which we are gathered, wherever we are. I'm on Gadigal land in Sydney. I like to say that I was also born on Wiradjuri land that was sacred and never ceded, and hailed them as the guardians of the earth and of all things that grow and breed in the soil, as trustees of the waters, the seas, streams, rivers, the ponds and lakes, and the rich variety of life in those waters. And we thank them for passing this wisdom and heritage to every people since the dream time. We also acknowledge the wrongs done to them by newcomers to this land, and we seek to be partners with them in righting these wrongs and in living together in peace and harmony with them and also with the land. And as we do this, we acknowledge the loss of hunting grounds, destruction of ceremonial places and sacred sites, and the great loss of life from all kinds of violence and disease. And we must also acknowledge the voices of the First Nations people that are being presented to us as a gift and out of love, as a voice from the heart, and may we listen to them. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Claude, for this acknowledgement, but also your call to us at this time and your reminder of why we're here. I think, as you've already said, that this webinar couldn't have come at a more important time. Violence, as we know it, continues to accelerate across the world, and we see it in our news every night. From Ukraine, Myanmar, Israel, the Middle East, Africa, and we could go on and on. Glenn Lockery, Susan Connolly and David Tutty come to us from a long history of disrupting our comforts as they've worked for peace and non-violence in our world. And we welcome the three of you particularly. Our presenters tonight will speak for about 10 minutes each. Following this, there'll be another 30 to 40 minutes for questions and discussion before a brief conclusion. You're invited to put questions in the chat box as the evening proceeds, and we hope to share some of these in the second half of our session. The webinar will conclude at approximately 8:30. Can I ask you, please, to make sure your microphone is muted, except during question time if you're asked to ask a question. The program tonight will be recorded, so if you don't wish to be part of the recording, please switch off your own video. And so tonight, our first speaker is Glenn Lockery. Glenn will focus on the first section of the encyclical, the human rights perspective, and he'll speak with us on the Uluru Statement from the Heart as a restorative justice process. Glenn is a Wiradjuri man, an artist, writer and Anglican priest. He's the chairperson of the National Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Anglican Council, the vicar of St Oswald's in Glen Iris, and artist in residence at St Paul's Anglican Cathedral in Melbourne. He's a leader at the Crawford School of Public Policy at the Australian National University in Canberra and the Anglican Diocese of Melbourne's educator and advocate for the voice. Under the banner of the Crawford School of Public Policy, Glenn has written a document, Unpacking the Statement from the Heart, a personal perspective from a Wiradjuri man. It's this reflection which will form the basis of his reflection today. Glenn, we're privileged to welcome you and the sharing of your wisdom with us.
Thank you very much for the kind invitation. Darab Linyabadu Wiradjuri Yawanadi Glenn Lockery Goambana and Yaradu Marang. I'm proud to be Wiradjuri. My name's Glenn Lockery. Goambana means welcome and Yaradu Marang means good day. And I come to you from the land of the people in Canberra. I'm sitting in a little hotel room thinking about what we need to talk about in terms of justice and peace. I have placed up before you there a document or a slide that talks about in my language, the various elements of the statement from the heart designed to bring about justice for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander and non-Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander in Australia. The process of justice that is spoken about in the statement from the heart is built on the concept that there is no justice for one if there is no justice for anyone if there's no justice for one. And Australia is yet to be a just country and be able to speak about justice in relation to any other country in the world with any authority, simply because it has never recognised Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people as equals, excluded them from the Constitution, excluded them from the capacity to be self-determining in their own, in our own capacity, our own lives, taken away the opportunity for us to have a voice on matters that related to us. Annoyingly, we have survived much longer than Alfred Deakin thought that we would, and we are still here and we're not going away. And we want justice, and that's what the statement from the heart is about. It's a very gentle ask for justice. It's not an ask that demands or takes or threatens or attacks, but it simply says there is a way we can come together if we come together to dialogue, discuss, engage, walk, just spend time and build relationship. It's a kinesthetic approach to justice. It's about relationships. All of Aboriginal thinking is kinesthetic, if you would like to think about it. It's about the kin. It's about your relationship to all other things. We see ourselves as being indigenous of the universe, as Kerry Arabina writes, and we are indigenous of the universe so that we carry within us all the elements of life that is shared amongst the rest of the universe. So we have a responsibility to act justly in all of those places. That's why we refer to ourselves as custodians. It's not simply just to care for other things. It's to act justly in our relationship with rivers, with waters, with people, and with those around us. So the idea in the statement from the heart and leading towards justice is that we begin with a voice. We begin with the capacity to be heard and seen. If you're not heard, you're not seen. If you're not seen, you don't exist. Much of the people who are involved in the justice issues around the world are those who aren't seen and their voices aren't heard. We hear a lot about the big ticket issues, what's going on in Israel, what's going on in Sudan, but the little people, the people who are carrying the damage, have no voices in these places, and including in Ukraine. And we need to divide a process that allows us to bring each other together over time to start to hear and say that somebody else is in the space. Winingaro is a language in our language means we have to listen, hear, and reflect, not on what is just simply in ourselves, but what is coming to us from outside ourselves, what is in the language of others, what's in the practices of others, that can begin to identify each one of us as equal. In the Australian scenario, this is why we want to be in the Constitution. In the Constitution means we're equal. In the Constitution means we have equity. In the Constitutions, we cease to be persona nullius, which is an empty body that other people use for their own purposes. So this process of moving around this circle begins in any kind of justice situation with being able to tell our story. Listen, hear, and reflect. And then we get to do, as I said on this little slide, is learning to listen to each other's story and allow space to reflect on what this means. And above all else, not necessarily doing much, but just at that stage, beginning our kinesthetic relationship. And it's a process that takes time. One of the issues we have with justice as we go, it never changes things. It's not designed to change things quickly. Justice is a slow growth tree. It's a slow growth forest. It is not something that we're able to simply go, we do this and we'll get justice for all. It's a slow growth process. And we have to sit with that. The elders in Canada would say to you that it takes 7 generations for justice. Look back at the things that we've been doing since the Second World War. How far into that are we? What else do we have to do? What kind of processes need to be in place? And then once we've heard each other and we've listened and reflected, we then begin to agree with each other on what the issues that need to be resolved are, what we need to talk about. Are the issues what we actually think they are? Or are there issues that we are unable to see, which empowers the injustice in our society? And one of the issues for Australia, and this is a constant argument we hear, is that Australia was built on racism. It was built on race, and the Western world, all of the Western world since the 15th century, built on race. So yes, Australia is a racist country, and we have to start to deal with that. And as Walter Mingolo says about coloniality is all over. It's not over, it's all over. And racism is not over, it's all over. It's in everything that we do, think, and say. So we have to agree together about things like that, because that's what drives the anger and the hate within our own country towards Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. I've done 110 of these things, and I can tell you Australia is racist, fearful, and ignorant of the history and the facts and the things that need to be dealt with. But we go from telling our story to hearing each other's story and agreeing on what is important. Nanga Yara, which is really important to learn about. Then we move from there to where we tell the truth, what it feels like to be in this space, how we feel when we are living in a place of injustice, what it feels like for those people who benefit from the injustice. In our case, those who stole the land and everybody that came afterwards who lives off the benefit of that, and how those who have been impacted by the injustice, our people who lost their land, lost their people, lost 70 to 80% of its population within the first 110 years, we have to tell how we feel as well. And once we do that, we find a commonality that joins us together, and we begin to see each other not as enemy, not as someone to be fearful of, not as someone that we need to blame, but someone who shares empathically with us the same colonial memory. And remember, much of the injustices across the world, and including war, comes out of a colonial memory. Colonialism was built on war as well. It was built on conquering and keeping those who were conquered in a space of powerlessness. So we need to talk about this and use this model to find that commonality and start to find a way to come from the grassroots up. In our culture, we would do this to resolve conflict. It's a BCP, before Cook and Phillip. We would use this process inside a community if somebody had behaved badly. We'd also use this process in relation to tribal or mob-to-mob involvement. Go around the story, sit in a circle and listen through this process so that you get away from the need to react violently, but to react in a way that repairs the injustice. And then we move to the last bit, which is about coming to life again. That's what the words from my language say, coming to life again, be resurrected. And that's where we de-link from those colonial models and we re-exist the models that gave life before that and gives us the opportunity to rebuild. In our cultures, that would often involve somebody getting a spear in the thigh. Not a random thrown spear, but a spear that was put in the thigh as a part of a process to repair and put back the community. It's not punishment, it's not payback, it's pedagogy. It helps us to learn how to live in relationship, in kinship with each other. So this cycle, and that's one of the most powerful things, and it's one of the sadnesses in my heart, that in the process towards a referendum, the this beautiful model of transformational forgiveness has been lost and given way to oppositional binary garbage that we are hearing between people and threatening, and you know, it's got to be a yes or it's got to be a no. We've just lost sight of what this could do for our country. And it's a model that we use inside schools every day. It's a model that we can take as a justice model. And for all of you who are sitting around that table, there's the story of Jacob, who thieves the land off Esau, takes his birthright, and goes and gets married, has a couple of wives, a bunch of kids, gets a whole bunch of animals, and then decides 25 years later he wants to go home and see the oldies. So he heads back, but he's not sure how Esau is going to treat him because he ripped Esau off something terribly. So when he gets to Peniel, he does the bravest thing a man can do. He sends the wife and kids on ahead to meet Esau, and he stays at the river. I say it was the bravest thing a man can do because I think when he meets the women later, he might be in for a little bit of a shock because they may say, "What were you thinking when you did that?" But what we have is that he spends the night at Peniel and he wrestles with a young man. And we often told that young man is God or an angel, but in reality, I suspect that young man was Jacob 25 years before. See, justice starts and begins when we come to grips with the things that we've done and the benefits that we've got from that. And that's what Jacob does in that night. And his appeal for a blessing is really an inner appeal to himself to forgive himself and to get himself to come to grips with the type of person he was that did that thing to his brother. There's very, very lot of similarities with most of the stories, the injustice stories we see around the world. He wakes up next morning and he's got a new name, Israel, a new purpose. We would wake up if we go through this process with a new name, and that would be called just. And he also wakes up with a dislocated hip. And he walks with a limp for the rest of his life. He has to change his behavior. He has to walk differently. He has to become somebody different in the world. And he lives that way forever. I also remind people that the last thing that Jesus did on the cross was Makarata. He took a spear in the side on behalf of you and I. And the first thing he does when he comes back and meets the disciples and Thomas, he says, he lifts up the shirt and says, "Have a look. I've done Makarata for you to repair the community. Now you have to walk differently. That's this process. That's justice in action. It's transformational. It's synthetic. It is powerful. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Glenn, for all you've shared. I loved your two phrases, the gentle ask for justice and the fact that it's about kin. And I think you've reminded us that we need prophetic human rights at this moment.
Yes.
And so it reminds us of John the 23rd's insights and the call to us to listen and, as you say, to hear and reflect and then to act justly. So thank you very much for that. And people might like to add questions to the chat box as we move on. But as we move on, we're reminded that we are facing many, many dangers. And we welcome you, Susan Connolly, to reflect on the second area of the encyclical, truth and discernment for the common good. Susan, we're reminded, is a sister of St. Joseph. She's advocated for the Timorese people for 30 years, mindful of the Australian presence in East Timor in 1942. The lack of Australian support when Timor was occupied for 24 years, and the continuing injustices over the resources of the Timor Sea. She's also concerned about the current situation of the people in West Papua. Her book, East Timor, Renee Girard and Neo-Colonial Violence, Scapegoating as an Australian Policy, uses Girard's theories on violence, scapegoating, and the Christian imperative of forgiveness and non-retaliation. I've no doubt at all, Susan, that we desperately need the message of challenge that you will bring us, and so we welcome your disruption.
Thank you very much. It's great to be here. And from the wealth of insight and challenge that the encyclical Pacem in Terris offers, I'm very happy to present something on truth and discernment, as you said, Jan, because truth and discernment are essential to the common good. René Girard, the French-American philosopher, was born 100 years ago this coming Christmas Day. His last book, Battling to the End, claims that the dual is the underlying structure of all human activities. This formidable thought can be viewed in the context of truth and lies, weapons and disarmament. Does the dual nurture the human good? Pacem in Terris states, before a society can be considered well-ordered, creative and consonant with human dignity, it must be based on truth. We are reminded that God is the first truth. Everyone has the right to be free to seek the truth, says the encyclical, and to be accurately informed about public events. The preeminence of truth applies not only in the personal arena, but between states. Differences must be settled in a truly human way, Pacem in Terris says, not by armed force, nor by deceit or trickery. How then do we deal with the current volume of untruthfulness? Now, we know there can be misinformation where people get the bull by the tail and make mistakes. But disinformation is calculated to deceive. It is a planned process of lies or half-truths designed to confuse, to anger, or to manipulate people. Mark Twain once said, a lie can travel halfway round the world while the truth is still putting on its shoes. We know that lies spread quickly on social media. It is an arena where both the ridiculous and the dangerous grab people's attention, while facts seem something of a letdown. Donald Trump, during his 4-year presidency, told 30,573 public lies, according to the Washington Post.
You listening to it? Yeah, you can hear it from me.
The relationship of the Australian people to the call to truth in Pacem in Terris is a fraught one. Daily, we are faced with many erroneous or misleading claims regarding the referendum on an Indigenous voice to Parliament. A concerning development was the news 2 weeks ago that the No Campaign management told its volunteers to emphasise fear rather than fact. We see denial of proven fact, such as the claim that there is no disadvantage among Indigenous peoples. We are told that the Uluru Statement from the Heart is a declaration of war on Australia. We are in the middle of a duel. It is not a duel between facts, as false claims can be checked and refuted. The duel is between facts and fear. Now, this is not something new in human experience, as we know, because fear is a powerful means of control. Too often, fear, insecurity and dependency have characterised the Australian nation in the modern world. Alan Renouf, a former head of the Department of Foreign Affairs, stated that Australians have been a frightened and intimidated people. There are books devoted to Australian fear. Alan Gingel's Fear of Abandonment, Anxious Nation by David Walker. Peter Stanley, previous principal historian at the Australian War Memorial, says, Australians have frightened themselves repeatedly with stories and novels depicting imaginary invasions. Australians have been fearful since colonisation. A small population in a huge landmass with an indefensible coastline and a history of subservience to whomever may appear to provide safety. When it comes to defence, many Australians appear to believe that the ANZUS Treaty obliges the United States to come to our aid in the event of attack. This is not so. The treaty merely requires the parties to consult together in the face of threat. Long after his years as Prime Minister, Malcolm Fraser advocated terminating the Australia-US alliance, saying that too great adherence to America affects Australian sovereignty. Claiming security through dependence on a greater power exposes Australians to the threats faced by that power, thereby heightening the very insecurity we seek to avoid. Now, of course, Australia has the obligation to defend itself and its people, as all others do. The problem is how to mount that defence. As Pacem in Terris so clearly states, if one country increases its military strength, others are immediately roused by a competitive spirit to augment their own supply of armaments. It comments on the fear of citizens who realise how technology ensures unimaginable slaughter and destruction. We are thus in a situation of an escalation to extremes, to quote René Girard. Girard wrote about Karl von Clausewitz, who realised that the world, engaged in constant duel, was heading for annihilation because of modern warfare's increasing capacity for harm. Clausewitz pulled back from the logical conclusion of his work and in the end devoted himself to various ho-hum discussions about strategy. Girard maintains that we are facing the reality that Clausewitz sidestepped because of our nuclear capabilities. Given the capability we have for total destruction, to continue this sidestepping requires our telling ourselves and each other a monumental lie. The lie that we can continue the duelling. Is there a way to avoid the escalation to extremes? The encyclical states nuclear weapons must be banned. But too many other destructive weapons exist, And the only truly human response must be non-violence. Australia's embrace of non-violence could be by way of armed neutrality. Neutrality has United Nations status, and there are about 18 countries today with some form of neutrality. A neutral Australia could not enter into treaties which oblige it to wage war. A neutral Australia could not supply arms to other nations, as happens now. We could not have foreign bases on our soil, and we would need much stronger defence forces so as not to entice attack from others. Australia is geographically well placed to be neutral, with no land borders and the benefits of huge distance. Being well armed, we would be a dangerous place to attack. Now, Sam Roggeveen of the Lowy Institute has written a book called The Echidna Strategy. He does not advocate for armed neutrality as such, but his approach to defence suggests a bolder Australian foreign policy than the present one. Roggeveen uses the image of the Australian echidna, which, like the porcupine, is no threat to anything as it is incapable of attack. Defensive policies and sufficient weapons and personnel, not a position of belligerence, would place Australia as a global echidna, being no threat to anyone, but too prickly to be threatened. Australia would then no longer be seen as a puppet of the United States and would have greater diplomatic clout in the region and beyond. Without US bases, Australia would no longer be a soft nuclear target for enemies of the United States as it is at present. Neutrality would enable Australia to use its considerable wealth and expertise to combat other major threats against the common good, climate change, global hunger, refugees. The current duel between the yes and no camps regarding the referendum shows how very potent lies are as weapons. I believe there is a solid attempt in the yes camp to remain positive and to argue from the facts. Noel Pearson's heartfelt presentation yesterday called on our shared love of country so we can step into the future with the common good as the primary aim. True love does not rely on nor benefit from lies. René Girard writes, Christ places humanity before a terrible alternative. Either continue to refuse to see that the dual is the underlying structure of all human activities, or escape from that hidden logic by means of a better one, that of love, of positive cooperation. Such mutuality requires the facts, and where there is dispute, our willingness to engage, to respect, to listen. It encourages truthfulness and lessens fear. Pacem in Terris recalls for us the great truth expressed by Pope Pius XII. Nothing is lost by peace. Everything may be lost by war. Thank you.
Thank you, Susan. I love the way that you share with us from your experiences. I love the way you pull no punches in speaking the truth. And I love the way that you've taken the encyclical and allied it with all those other aspects of the realities confronting us. Thank you so much for all of that. And again, I just remind people, if you have any questions for Susan, if you could put them in the chat box and we'll move on to them after our final speaker. And our final speaker tonight is David Tutty. David is of Anglo-Celtic descent from Aotearoa, New Zealand. He spent 9 years in South Africa, where he worked in a rural area while completing his doctorate in missiology. David now works as the Executive Officer for the Social Justice Commission in the Catholic Diocese of Toowoomba. He's been a Pax Christi member since 1992, which speaks volumes about his commitment to peace and the core of John the 23rd's message. David tonight is going to speak with us on seeking healing, a necessary step for peacemaking. As we face the challenges of the referendum and the polarisation that's strangling us, the longed for healing that Susan spoke about throughout our communities, it's been highlighted for all of us in these past weeks. I know, David, that you'll assist us at this time in the light of the encyclical to reflect on the urgency of this, but also to offer some strategies we might adopt as we move forward. We welcome you tonight.
Thank you, Jane. I'll just set up the Can you see that?
Yes, you might need to speak a little more loudly.
Okay, I'll do that.
Thank you.
Part of the title of the conference was Pacem and Terris today, 2023 and beyond. In some ways, I'm going to look at some things that Pope John the 23rd did not consider, and I think it's been part of the development since then. I'd like to explore two topics that I see as fundamental to peacemaking. I want to look below the level of symptoms, below the level of militarism, nuclear arsenals and war, and even more fundamental than focusing on fear, be that individual or collective. I want to look at collective trauma, unresolved collective trauma, and our destructive images of God. Because in order to be genuine peacemakers, we need healing from our unresolved collective trauma and healing from our images of God that dehumanize others and exploit the rest of creation. Oh, sorry. We all know something about the reality of trauma. We know that trauma is a response mechanism to highly stressful events. These events could be natural disasters, accidents, war, death of loved ones, even cancer diagnoses. The trauma response is an evolutionary protective process. We hold trauma in our nervous systems, in our entire bodies, and even in our social structures. The ideal is that after the traumatic event has passed, we find ways of facing the pain, of healing ourselves of the trauma we hold. We need to seek healing as a way of going forward. For most of us, this does not happen very easily. We are often unwilling to face the pain, but if we don't, we are doomed to carry that pain into the future. We are then shaped and limited by unresolved, unhealed pain. And we can only see the world, see everything involved in the world through this pain. My guess is that most people are only aware of trauma at the individual level. Yet trauma is never purely an individual problem. In fact, there is increasing research into the nature and dynamics of collective trauma. Practitioners like Thomas Hubel and Gabor Mate even argued that it is impossible to separate personal trauma from collective trauma. This is what we see in what we call intergenerational trauma. This is trauma that is passed on through families, cultures, institutions, and even epigenetics. In this presentation, I want to focus on the perpetrators of violence. I want to argue that the perpetrators, be they individuals, institutions, or even nations, are shaped by collective trauma. I want to suggest that those from Britain who invaded and colonized this land did so because they were acting out of their collective trauma. Britain was a very harsh place, a very brutal place before and during the colonial dynamic, and that would go back for centuries. The social hierarchy, the so-called enlightened worldview, the traditional dominant theologies, and the brutal economic system led many of their own people to be seen as expendable. With the enclosure of the commons, the Scottish Highland clearances, the Irish plantation system, those who were poor were pushed into squalid, polluted, newly industrialized towns and forced to work long hours for little money. At that time, you could be imprisoned for stealing a loaf of bread. And then, of course, as we know, transported to the other side of the world as punishment. I want to suggest that Australian white fella culture is shaped by harsh collective trauma. This needs to be faced in order for a culture of peacemaking to be possible. It needs to be faced so that we halt the ongoing traumatizing of First Nations people, and it needs to be faced so that we halt the militaristic self-defense strategy, which includes nuclear submarines. White fellas and white fella culture is shaped by collective trauma, and the only way forward is to seek healing. A significant part of our collective trauma is our destructive images of God. An Israeli academic, Yochai Ataria, claims that Western culture was shaped by the story of Abraham finding Isaac in order to sacrifice him. He claims that the dominant theologies of the West have been based on the need to appease a bloodthirsty God, a God who keeps count and punishes wrongdoers. Now, looking at who's on Zoom tonight, many of us would have grown up with a strong awareness of hell and of the fear that God will send us to hell if we commit mortal sin. Out of this line of thinking, we can say, as Dennis Lynn, and you can see a photo of a little book called Good Goats, as they argue, if God can send God's enemies to hell, then it's okay for us to punish our enemies, even by dropping a nuclear bomb on them. We become like the God we adore. While prophetic 60 years ago, Pacem and Terris came out of a long history of natural law and theologizing from above. Since then, there's been many challenges to this traditional Catholic starting point, and I think these challenges help us identify what we need to heal in our images of God. Liberation theologians help us see the critical importance of our hermeneutical lens. They help us to understand the option for the poor, the centrality of praxis, and that all God talk is contextual. We cannot universalize the Western perspective. In fact, the West needs to learn from the theologies that arise from the margins. Feminist and womanist theologians have challenged patriarchy and white privilege. They help us critique the power language that we use for God. And theologians who have unpacked the dynamics of the Roman Empire give us new insights into Jesus' stark challenges to the power structures of his day. Theologians who have focused on suffering, they help us see that God suffered with Jesus and that God continues to suffer with those who are victims of injustice. They help us see that God is vulnerable, the challenge to that word almighty, and that God is nothing but love. Catholic workers highlight the most disturbing challenge of the gospel. Love your enemies, enemy love. First Nations peoples remind us of our intrinsic interconnectedness with all of creation. And most recently, Pope Francis has been able to bring some of that together, calling us to rebuild our wounded world through responding to an inseparable cry of the poor and cry of the earth. All of these insights challenge us to heal the images of God that underpin white fella culture. They remind us that Jesus revealed God as compassionate love, who calls us to seek justice. And to conclude, we need healing from our collective trauma and our destructive images of God. And we need to do this so that we can become genuine peacemakers today and in the future. Thank you.
Thank you so much, David. You've given us so much to think about and so much to reflect on. And I think there are a lot of questions embedded in what you have shared with us today. But before we move on to the questions, Maggie has just prepared for us a silent reflection. It picks up some of the images that our speakers have shared with us, plus some of the images that really speak to us in our world at this moment. So let's just take time in silence to look at these images, and then we'll take time for some questions. Thank you so much, Maggie, for those reflections, and especially thanks to our three speakers. I think you've challenged us tonight to get below the surface of the images, to really look at what's going on underneath, to ask about personal and collective trauma, and also, I think, to point us in some directions that we might take into the future. And I know we have a couple of questions already that will invite us to move beyond. So, Charles, I know you have a question that you'd like to ask. So if I could hand over to you, you would unmute yourself and then ask your question. I think it's to David.
I haven't written the question down before me. Could you read it out for me, please, Jan?
It's disappeared from my screen, I'm afraid.
I can do it, Jan, if you like.
Thank you very much, Claude. I'd be very grateful.
David, how do we best immediately organise facing up to intergenerational trauma being faced by Australian Indigenous peoples, post-colonials and post-World War II migrants? You're muted here.
Mm-hmm. Thank you.
Thanks, Claude.
One of the areas of research has been around the state of the perpetrator in domestic violence. And often, not to excuse the domestic violence, but often when they look at the formative history of the perpetrator, there is trauma in that person's history. That's the individual level. There is a number of academics who are looking at collective trauma and looking at what shapes the perpetrator of collective crimes, whether it be invasion and colonization, whether it be initiating a war, invasion. And they're trying to look at the need for the group to find some way of facing the pain, whether it be through truth-telling, what's led them to the point where they've denied or pushed down the trauma, the collective trauma, what's led them to act out of it without actually without choosing to face it. There's a huge amount of work yet to go, Charles. I'm hoping to do another paper in November focusing on this. My initial response to your question, First Nations intergenerational trauma, one of the points of healing of that is if the perpetrators of that trauma face their own trauma so that they no longer traumatize others.
A huge issue, I think, and of particular relevance to us at this moment in our own story.
Can I make a comment on that? Because that's a big issue.
Certainly.
Unfortunately, we look at First Nations trauma, intergenerational trauma, and we use that as an excuse to engage with our own intergenerational trauma. What one Vietnam vet calls a bleeding down of the trauma through our nation. And we're never going to resolve the Australian non-Indigenous populations intergenerational trauma until there are some real facts faced about how this country came into being, how we set up the divisive race boundaries to separate us, how we used one group of people as an enemy, to go back to what Susan said earlier, that dueling process, and to lay off the blame for all the things to one group of people. I don't see intergenerational trauma. I talk about it a lot, and people look at you. Non-Indigenous populations have so pushed that bucket and dumped it on Indigenous people that they're unaware of it in their own lives, unaware of how it got to them, taking David's stuff, going right back to Scotland, but it's further than that. It goes right back into the 15th century. It's been sitting there and it's driven colonization. It's driven colonization, and it still drives colonization today. And I see it in the conversations I have. For our people to deal with intergenerational trauma, somebody has to see them and believe that it's real, not just a mechanism by which people can make a lot of money. You know, we've developed a process in this country that has said to Aboriginal people who have had everything taken away from them and who protest with the only thing they have left on, and that's their body. And that is what post-generational trauma involves. So all they have left, so they can't speak up against white guy, they can't have no voice in that field, so they self-harm, they commit suicide, they impact the families that they live amongst because they're powerless and their body is the only way out. So one of the reasons why Statement from the Heart and the Voice is a decolonial act is that it begins to address that silence, and we get a voice to talk about things so that we can begin to change that intergenerational process over a period of time. But we also, that's why at the bottom of my thing, I say we both have to deal with that colonial memory, that intergenerational memory, that bleeding down that is running right the way through our country.
Thank you. And that question really...
Can I comment on that as well?
Can I just ask Susan first if you'd like to add something, please? You might.
My comment was really about Glenn's response.
Susan, we can't hear you. Go on. Yeah, you can.
I beg your pardon. No, I'd rather not comment at this time. Thanks.
Thank you. I'll come back to you. Charles.
Yeah. Purposely in the question, I went beyond the colonial to the people who are the colonizers, the post-war immigrants. I think each of them, in the experience of my life, have been working through issues bit by bit. There are failures and successes. I remember, Glenn, we have spoken about this before. I come from a colonial past along a riverbank, and you said to me, you know nothing of the land. And I said, I know something of the land. I know my ancestors came and they were traumatized, Scotland, as you say. They were working through those issues. Some of them succeeded, some of them didn't. I've worked overseas in South Korea. I know many people who have come as migrants to Australia. Some have succeeded, some haven't. And to me, it's not a matter of blame, but it's trying to get people to work through those various stages of dealing with their trauma. So that is my real concern, and my pastoral concern as well, personal. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Yes.
Can I just follow up the part to do with, I suppose, non-European migrants that have come? Many of them have come with some trauma already. But from a New Zealand perspective, where there was a treaty all others that came to Aotearoa came on the side of the Crown. All of the migrants that came from whichever country they came on the side of the Crown and had to learn and take some responsibility for a more healthy and constructive and just relationship with Māori. Part of the journey I've noticed here is the moment you start talking about First Nations and whitefella, people want to throw in the multicultural one just to confuse and mess up the situation. So they avoid, as a way of avoiding facing the truth of the colonial dynamic, because all of the key institutions founded here have got their roots in Britain.
Absolutely.
The cultures and the dynamics of what founded this thing called Australia have got their roots in Britain, and have got their roots in the wounded culture of Britain, the trauma that the British brought here.
Yeah.
Thank you. So we'll just hold that for a moment. Anne Lanyon, you have a question.
Hi, thank you. I'm just thinking in my own family about the intergenerational trauma that I feel is made manifest through our family involvements in the military, and that connection with the Anzac myth. David, your comments on that?
Dan, hello. I grew up in a small town, east coast of the North Island, just outside Napier, and I used to walk past a World War I memorial on my way to primary school. The identity of the colonial new nation they call New Zealand was the Anzac myth is at the basis of that, and I understand it is here in Australia as well. Having to remember that, one, it was a catastrophe at Gallipoli, but two, we were basically fighting on the side of the British Empire. We were part of the empire, and we were there supporting empire. So how it came to be our founding identity is really difficult to understand.
And
oh, by the way, my birthday is Anzac Day.
The other comment to make about that in an Australian scenario is that the primary reason why the Australian politicians decided to go to war with the British was to ensure that Australia remained a white supremacy project, and to make sure they shored up their relationships with England and the Europeans in case, as they saw coming down the line, the Japanese got out of hand. So it was a white supremacy process that sent our boys to war, and it's not that great heroic Australian myth. It was based on race.
Archbishop Manning's called it an economics war, which is not a racist war. I think there's a lot of different aspects of history, that we need to be aware of.
I guess my second part to that question is the awareness now of the trauma that's caused to our young people who've gone overseas to recent wars. Comments on that, please.
It's not just the people who go overseas. A lot of our young people prior to Afghanistan and even since then, who are particularly involved in the turning back the boats, etc., there was a moral trauma that affected those people watching and being involved in those kind of processes. I was in the Navy at the time and worked with a lot of those young men and women who whose own moral positions were very, very different to that of the government that they were serving. And they were standing on boats, turning back families and sending them back into what were possibly disaster, and having to come away with that. So it's not just war in the military that brings about that trauma. It is the conflict between people's morals and values and ethics, and that of the governments who make the faceless people who make the decisions about what is right and what isn't right. So the trauma is, yes, those have been to Afghanistan, that's awful. And they come back with that often visible signs of trauma. But there are the others that are in that place who are engaged in acts that would never be described as war, but are acts that fracture their own moral state. So there is a different kind of trauma involved in that as well, and it still bleeds down.
Susan.
Yes, thank you. I find this very, very interesting. But I come back all the time to how important the study of history is, the war, the Anzac, but all connected to how Australians as a whole, from my perspective anyway, have a sense of guilt, really, about what happened, about our Indigenous peoples, and we're not willing to face it. I think the younger generations are exposed to it more than we certainly were at school, for sure, and I certainly hope that is true. But it's something about the human. I'm particularly interested in the Anzac understanding, the way that Australia has sort of taken on, this mantle of, aren't we wonderful because we were there at Anzac and we did this. And I live with a sister whose father was there. And it is fantastic. I have great pride in, although the qualities, now I know very well that the qualities have perhaps been shown at the expense of the deficits and the reason we were there, etc. But how strange it is that we're able to look back at something that makes us look really good. But when it comes to looking at the Indigenous people and what happened there, like it's the great Australian silence, as Stanner said, but how important it is now, whatever happens at the referendum, that the history is really looked into, and that, but I want to learn more of the history. I do. Look, I'll just tell you a quick little story. My great-great-grandparents were both convicts, and they were on a property near Mudgee, owned by Mr. George Sutter. Now, they were treated very well. And the story in our family was that Mr. Sutter treated both the convicts and the local Aborigines who were still there, the Indigenous people are still there, he treated them well. And all through my life, I've thought, oh, isn't that good? We were treated well and that. But I wonder how I would feel if I knew that, say, my great-great-grandfather, say, killed Aboriginal people. I read something recently that I thought was so honest and so true about a person who, I forget his name, who found out about that. Like, have we got the courage as a nation to look at our past and take the bad as well as the good and just face up to the thing that what we've done to our own people, what we've done and what that is doing to us? Yeah.
That story of George Sutter is all about the area that I came from. And that was,
oh, yes.
And it's about the Bathurst Wars, which was the war of extermination, fought between the English and Irish troops and the Wiradjuri people. And often we talk about the convicts being bringers of that trauma. And while they did, they weren't the ones that were behind the processes. They were the landowners, the Lawsons, the Coxes, the people at the top end of the New South Wales, in that particular case, hierarchy, who did have convicts as workers, but the whole process was managed by the higher authorities. Sutter was wonderful. I went to school with his great-granddaughter. But in the area that I grew up in, and this is the trauma that I carry every day, is almost 100% of the Aboriginal people in the area were exterminated in that war called the War of Extermination.
There were none left. That's right.
And we don't talk about that. We leave it for, like we do with all the other things, for us as Aboriginal people to come to grips with our trauma. But that trauma needs to be healed by those who participated in it. And I often get some of the most horrific stories told to me by people who are as youthfully challenged as us, who come up and talk about their grandfather or great-grandfather taking the gun off the cupboard and going down and shooting the blacks in the creek, as one woman came and told me. And that was a family history that should, it seeped through the whole bodies of everybody, but nobody talked about it. And she came to me in her 80s, and we sat and she cried and we talked and we unpacked that trauma she'd carried with her all of her life. Now, there was nothing in me that says there's anything. All that I had to give her was compassion and the opportunity to tell the story. She forgave herself. That's the process that we were doing in that. Yeah. And I have other people in my church who do it regularly. What happened to the people who were on the farm when great-granddad got the place? That trauma is there. That is that memory. How did I get to be so how did I become able to benefit so well from the taking of other people's land and others haven't? And take the other point about immigrants. I had a 13-year-old Indian boy came to me a week or two ago and said, I want to vote in the referendum because I want to vote yes. And I said, you're 13, unless we can change your birth certificate, we've got a problem. But his mother came over and she talked about the fact that they'd come out from India. They weren't people from the higher caste levels. So she said to him, you've lived a privileged life in Australia, a life you would never have had anywhere else. And it's now you're responsible to help heal this trauma. So he came up with a very ingenious program of going back to school and going to hand out brochures to all of his mates to take home to their parents, and that infiltration. He's a peace worker, right, already. But it's this, I have not found anybody who's come from anywhere else who has a great difficulty with this process we're going through with the referendum, because they go, we're here because that was what happened to us. We understand it, we get it. Australians who identify as Australians because they've been born here, they have great difficulty dealing with it because it means they have to face some of the skeletons rattling in the cupboard.
Thank you. What a gift
the
change has been. And unfortunately, we don't have time for any more questions, even though it would be really lovely if we could. I think I've been so struck tonight by the conversation around truth, around trauma, around the way that you have managed to reflect more deeply, to go below the surface of all the things that are going on at this time. And for me, in a sense, it's been about theology from the margins. And I think it's been such a gift to us. And I had a number of things that I was thinking I'd finish with tonight, but perhaps the most accurate thing I could use to finish are Jimi Hendrix's words. When the power of love overcomes the love of power, the world will know peace. I think John the 23rd challenged us to it. As you reminded us, David, we have moved beyond his words now to a new space. Yep. And tonight's been an opportunity for all of us to go below what's happening on the surface and to really start to grapple with what's facing us as a nation, but also as a world community. So I thank all of you. I thank our three speakers in particular for enabling us to go below the surface. I thank Pax Christi in particular for making this evening possible. And I wish all of you all the best for the next 2 weeks? Let's vote yes.
Yes.
All right.
Thank you, everyone.
Okay.
It's been wonderful.
Thank you, Jan.
True,
Jane,
Glenn.
could I just, as I'd like to just thank the speakers as well, on behalf of Pax Christi and the National Council. We put this together very, very quickly, and I'm very grateful for the wonderful presentations and that we had tonight. I just want to also acknowledge the work of the National Council people who put this together, and Caesar de Mello, whose article was put down as a possible something to read beforehand, or still do it afterwards. But I got a lot out of these talks. I would like to go over them again, and just finish off with I work at the Edmund Rice Centre for Justice and Community Education. It seems to be that their values, the three values of that centre, about presence, compassion, and liberation, somehow came together in this whole evening as well. Thank you.